The sound began at 2:14 on the morning of December 18th, 1949. The operator on duty at Chilean Station Arturo Prat, a prefabricated research outpost anchored to the western edge of the Antarctic Peninsula at 63 degrees south, heard it first through the hydrophone array, a low harmonic pulse that lasted 11 seconds, rose slightly in pitch, then cut to silence. He noted the time, the waveform's rough frequency between 40 and 60 hertz, he estimated, and the fact that it seemed to originate from beneath the ice shelf, somewhere to the southwest. He did not hear it again that night. 19 hours and 7 minutes later, it returned. Same duration, same rise, same abrupt termination. He logged it again. By the third occurrence, the station commander, Lieutenant Emilio Vargas, had begun a dedicated acoustic journal, a red cloth-bound notebook in which every pulse would be recorded. Timestamp, duration, bearing, any deviation from the established pattern. For 87 days, that pattern held. Every 19 hours, the sound. Every entry in the log identical in structure, the only variations minor. A fluctuation of seconds in the interval, a slight drift in bearing, never more than 2 degrees, and once, on January 9th, a note that the tone had seemed, and I quote, "más profundo," deeper, though the hydrophone trace showed no measurable change in frequency. The men did not panic. They were scientists, technicians, a radio operator, a cook. They had been briefed on icequakes, on the groan and fracture of glacial shelves, on the strange acoustics of a continent where sound travels differently, bends through cold water and compressed ice in ways that make distance meaningless. But ice does not keep time. Ice does not pulse at intervals measured to the minute across 3 months, and ice does not move. On March 7th, 1950, the sound changed. The interval shortened. 19 hours became 18 hours and 41 minutes. The next cycle, 18 hours and 18, then 17 hours, 52. The log entries, which had been sparse and factual, became longer. Vargas noted that the bearing had shifted, no longer a slow drift, but a deliberate arc, tracking northeast toward the station. On March 10th, he wrote that the duration of each pulse had increased to 14 seconds, and that the hydrophone operator, a man named Sepulveda, reported feeling the vibration through the steel frame of the equipment table before the sound registered on the instruments. Not at the same time, before. On March 12th, the interval was down to 16 hours. The bearing was now almost due south, less than 30 kilometers by Vargas's triangulation, and closing. The logbook records that Sepulveda asked to be relieved of hydrophone duty. Vargas refused. There were 6 men at the station. They had roles. On March 14th, the pulse came every 15 hours. Vargas wrote that all personnel had now felt the vibration, a sensation he described as similar to standing near a large engine at idle, but the sensation came through the ice, through the wooden floor of the station, and there was no engine within 300 kilometers. He added in a separate line that the sound was no longer confined to the hydrophone. It could be heard faintly with the naked ear if you stood outside and pressed your body to the ice. One of the junior researchers, whose name is listed only as Borges, attempted this and returned inside after less than a minute, refusing to speak for the remainder of the day. March 17th, interval 13 hours, 51 minutes. The bearing placed the source 11 kilometers southwest of the station, depth unknown, moving in what Vargas now described as a spiral pattern, each loop tighter, each cycle closer. He wrote that the tone had become, and this is his word, resonant, not louder but more present, as though it were no longer something heard through water and ice, but something that had begun to inhabit the structure of the station itself. The radio operator attempted to transmit a message to the Chilean Naval Command in Valparaiso requesting immediate instruction. The message was logged as sent, but no reply is recorded. On March 19th, the interval was 11 hours, 33 minutes. The source was now less than 6 kilometers away. Vargas wrote that the pulse could be heard inside the station without hydrophones, without pressing one's ear to anything. a low, sustained hum that seemed to come from all directions and none, and that during the most recent occurrence, the hanging oil lamps in the common room had swayed slightly, though there was no wind and no one had touched them. He wrote that Borges had begun to pace. He wrote that Sepulveda had asked again to be removed from his post, and again Vargas had refused, but this time he added a line. I do not know what else to tell him. March 21st, 1950. The final entries. The interval had collapsed to 9 hours, 47 minutes. The bearing, 3.2 kilometers, almost directly beneath the station, depth estimated at 800 to 1,000 meters. Though Vargas noted the triangulation had become difficult because the sound now seemed to reflect off the underside of the ice in ways that distorted the reading. He described the most recent pulse as lasting 19 seconds, the longest yet, and said that it had been accompanied by a pronounced vibration in the floor, strong enough that a coffee cup on the table had shifted several centimeters. He wrote that the sound was no longer a pulse, it was a tone, sustained, wavering slightly in pitch, almost. He crossed this word out, then wrote it again, almost vocal. The next entry is timed 4 hours later, mid-afternoon by the pale Antarctic daylight. It consists of 3 words. It is here. No description, no coordinates, no analysis. Just that. The final entry in the red logbook is a single word, written in a hand that does not match Vargas's earlier script, larger, unsteady, the ink heavier as though the pen had been pressed hard into the page. Cacano. Close. The Chilean Navy retrieved the logbook in late April when the relief ship finally broke through the pack ice and found Station Arturo Prat empty. The recordings, 7 reel-to-reel tapes, each marked with dates and calibration notes in Vargas's meticulous hand, were boxed and classified immediately upon return to Valparaiso. They have never been released, but 3 men who served on the acoustic analysis team in 1951 were interviewed separately decades later, and their accounts align on several key points. The waveform was not mechanical, it was not seismic, it was not ice fracture, not cavitation, not the groan of a glacier carving into the sea. One of them, a sonar technician named Esteban Ruiz, said in 1989 that the signature most closely resembled a biological vocalization, a mammalian call, structured and modulated, but at a frequency and amplitude that would require a source body many times the size of the largest blue whale ever recorded. He said the analysis team had been ordered to produce a geological explanation. He said they could not. I have seen a fragment of that analysis, a 2-page typewritten summary declassified by accident in a batch of unrelated Antarctic survey documents released in 2003. It describes the sound as exhibiting rhythmic variation consistent with respiratory or circulatory function, and notes that the dominant frequency, between 32 and 38 Hz, falls within the range used by baleen whales for long-distance communication, but that the recorded intensity would require an organism with a body mass exceeding 400 metric tons and a resonance chamber of corresponding scale. The summary states plainly that no such animal is known to science, living, or extinct. It then pivots, abruptly, to a discussion of subglacial volcanism and trapped gas pockets, theories the data did not support but which the authors clearly felt obligated to offer. The final line of the fragment reads, "Further investigation is not recommended." But it is the triangulation data, reconstructed from the logbook entries, that resists every conventional frame. Vargas and his team had plotted the source location over 87 days, and the pattern is unmistakable. A slow inward spiral, tightening with each cycle, the bearing shifting in a manner that suggests deliberate motion, not drift, not the passive displacement of an object carried by current or tide. The thing was moving, and it was moving toward the station. The calculated rate of approach was consistent between 40 and 60 meters per day, except for the final week, when the distance collapsed by nearly 3 kilometers in less than 70 hours. If the source was biological, if it was a living creature, then it was navigating beneath the Ross ice shelf with purpose and precision. following a path that required it to avoid submerged ridges, trench walls, and pressure zones that would crush anything softer than steel. Marine biologists I have consulted carefully, without providing full context, have told me that no known animal navigates that way under solid ice. Whales surface, seals surface, even the colossal squid, which can dive to abyssal depths, does not move in calculated spirals toward a fixed point on the surface. One researcher said to me, "If something did that, we would have to assume it knew the station was there. And then there is the physical phenomenon described in the final days, the thing Vargas and the others felt but could not see, the vibration in the floor." It began on March 18th, faint enough that Vargas initially attributed it to wind stress on the station's support pylons, a common occurrence in the austral autumn when katabatic gales descend from the interior. But the vibration was synchronous with the sound pulse, occurring at exact 19-hour intervals, and it grew stronger as the source drew nearer. By March 21st, objects were moving. A coffee cup, the oil lamps. Vargas wrote that the vibration lasted as long as the sound, 19 seconds in that final recorded instance, and that it felt, he wrote this twice, as though something very large had exhaled beneath them. Not an earthquake. Not a tremor, a single sustained pressure, rising and fading, rhythmic, patient. There is a technical term in glaciology for the acoustic coupling between a subglacial cavity and the ice sheet above it: harmonic amplification. If a large enough void exists beneath the ice, and if a low-frequency sound is produced within it, the ice itself can act as a resonator, transmitting the vibration across kilometers. It is the same principle that allows whale song to travel entire ocean basins. But harmonic amplification requires a cavity, and in 1950 no such cavity was known to exist beneath Station Arturo Prat. The ice shelf in that region was thought to be grounded, resting on bedrock or compressed sediment with no significant gaps. The men at the station believed they were standing on solid ice, hundreds of meters thick, backed by the frozen continent. They were not supposed to be above water. They were not supposed to be above anything. In 211, a joint Argentine-Norwegian glaciological survey conducted ground-penetrating radar mapping of the Western Ross ice shelf, including the coordinates where Station Arturo Prat once stood. The station itself is long gone, dismantled in 1953 and never rebuilt. But the survey detected an anomaly. A large subglacial void, irregular in shape, roughly elliptical, extending nearly 5 kilometers in length and reaching a maximum depth of 3 kilometers below the surface ice. The void is filled with seawater connected to the ocean beneath the shelf by a narrow basal channel. The survey report describes it as a previously unrecognized sub-ice marine cavity and notes that its size and depth make it one of the largest such features ever recorded in Antarctica. The report does not speculate on how the cavity formed. It does not mention the 1950 station or the logbook or the sound, but the coordinates match. And when I contacted one of the Norwegian researchers and asked cautiously whether anything unusual had been found inside the cavity, any debris, any biological material, any indication of what might inhabit such a space, she told me the sonar had detected something on the cavity floor, a mass too large and too regular to be a rock formation, but that the image resolution was insufficient to identify it. She said a follow-up expedition had been planned. She said it was quietly cancelled. She would not say why. The last transmission from Station Arturo Prat was logged at 02:14 hours on March 19, 1950. It was not a distress call. It was a single word sent by radio to the Chilean naval base at Punta Arenas, Cercano. Close. The operator at Punta Arenas requested clarification. No response came. For the next 11 hours, the base attempted to re-establish contact. The radio at the station remained active. The carrier signal was still being transmitted, indicating the equipment was functional and powered, but no one answered. At 1400 hours, Punta Arenas dispatched a supply vessel, the ARA Yelcho, with orders to investigate. The Yelcho was already en route for a scheduled resupply visit in early April. The orders moved the departure forward by 2 weeks. The ship reached the station on March 23rd, 4 days after the final transmission. What the crew of the Yelcho found has never been formally disclosed. The official record states that the station was intact, that no structural damage was observed, and that the 6 men stationed there, Subofficial Hector Ruiz, radio operator, Subofficial Ernesto Gallardo, meteorologist, Soldado Américo Vidal, mechanic, Soldado Luis Moreno, cook, Soldado Ramón Castillo, assistant, and the station commander, Teniente Segundo Jorge Álvarez, were not present. The logbook, the meteorological records, the seismographic data, and the reel-to-reel recordings of the sound were collected and transported back to Valparaiso. The station was provisioned, re-equipped, and restaffed within 6 weeks. The new crew was instructed not to discuss the disappearance of the previous team. They were told the men had been reassigned. No public search was conducted. No families were notified of a disappearance because officially there was no disappearance. The men were listed as having completed their tour and returned to the mainland. I have searched for them. Hector Ruiz appears in the 1952 Santiago telephone directory, listed as residing in the Recoleta district. But there is no death record, no subsequent directory entry, and no military pension file. Ernesto Gallardo's name appears on a 1948 meteorological paper published by the Chilean Antarctic Institute. After March 1950, his name appears nowhere. The others leave even less. Luis Moreno has a baptismal record from 1921 in the town of Osorno. No marriage, no death, no census entry after 1950. It is as if all 6 men stepped off the edge of the record. But there is one surviving photograph. It was not included in the classified file sent to Valparaiso. It was found in 1973, tucked inside a logbook from a different station, Station Bernardo O'Higgins, more than 200 kilometers to the north, by a maintenance engineer conducting an inventory of old records. The photograph is a standard issue black and white print, slightly overexposed, dated by hand on the reverse, 19 Marzo 1950. It shows the ice field surrounding Station Arturo Prat, taken from an elevated perspective, likely from the roof of the main building. The station structures are visible in the lower left corner of the frame, and in the center of the image, roughly 70 meters from the station, is a fissure in the ice. It is narrow at the edges, widening toward the middle, roughly 15 meters long, dark and very clearly open. The ice around it is fractured in a radial pattern, as though the surface had been pushed upward from below and then collapsed inward. No such fissure appears in any photograph taken at the station prior to March. The supply logs from January 1950 make no mention of any ice fracture. The meteorological reports describe stable surface conditions throughout February. The fissure was not there. And then it was. The photograph was never classified, because it was never supposed to exist. When it was discovered in 1973, it was brought to the attention of the Chilean Navy's Hydrographic and Oceanographic Service. A request was made to inspect the original negative. The negative could not be located. The photograph was described as of uncertain provenance and returned to the O'Higgins Station archive, where it remained until a researcher digitized it in 1999 as part of a historical documentation project. I have a copy. You can find it online if you search carefully, usually mislabeled as a crevasse or a pressure ridge. But look closely at the shape of the opening. It is not a crevasse, which forms as a linear crack from lateral stress. It is not a pressure ridge, which builds upward, not downward. It is an entry point, or an exit. The recordings were placed under naval seal in 1950 and have never been released. In 1998, a Chilean journalist named Claudio Ibáñez submitted a Freedom of Information request for any materials related to the 1950 Antarctic acoustic anomaly. His request was denied on the grounds that the materials were classified under national security law. Ibáñez appealed. During the appeal process, the Navy's legal office stated that the recordings had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1961. But in 2003, a former naval archivist named Alberto Sanchez, then in his 70s and retired, mentioned in an interview with a regional newspaper that he had personally handled the Arturo Prat materials in 1982, more than 20 years after they were supposedly destroyed. He described them as sealed metal canisters, very heavy, labeled with red tags. He said he had been ordered to transfer them to a secure facility in Punta Arenas. He said he was told never to speak of it. The interviewer did not follow up. Sanchez died in 2007. I have tried to locate the interviewer. I have tried to locate the facility in Punta Arenas. I cannot, but others have heard it. In 2003, a team of American oceanographers deployed autonomous underwater listening stations beneath the Ross ice shelf as part of a study on ice shelf stability. One of the stations, positioned roughly 8 kilometers from the 1950 coordinates, recorded a low-frequency acoustic signal over a period of 4 days in January 2004. The team described it in their internal notes as similar in structure to blue whale vocalizations, but lower in pitch and with an unusually regular interval. The interval was not 19 hours, it was 22. The data was included in a preliminary report submitted to the National Science Foundation. The report was never published. When I contacted the lead researcher, Dr. Melissa Hargrove, now retired, and asked her directly whether she believed the sound was biological, she paused for a long time before answering. She said, "I believed it was something that had learned to mimic biology." I asked her what she meant. She would not elaborate. I asked if she still had the recordings. She said they had been archived. She said she did not know where. In 2011, a Chilean glaciologist named Dr. Ramon Ibarra led a ground-penetrating radar survey of the Danco coast as part of a broader effort to map subsurface melt channels. His team spent 11 days working a grid that included the coordinates of Station Arturo Prat. On the 8th day, the radar returned an anomaly at a depth of 3,200 meters, a void, roughly oval in shape, approximately 40 meters across at its widest point, with walls that the instrument described as smooth. Not fractured ice, not compressed sediment, smooth. Ibarra's report, published in the Journal of Glaciology in 2013, noted the void but offered no explanation for its formation. In the discussion section, he wrote only this: "The cavity's geometry is inconsistent with known mechanisms of subglacial erosion observed elsewhere in the Antarctic ice sheet." I have read that paper 6 times. What stays with me is not what he said. It is what he did not say. He did not speculate. He did not offer a hypothesis. A man does not spend his career studying ice and then fall silent in front of an impossibility unless he has decided that silence is safer than the truth. I contacted Dr. Ibarra in 2019. He agreed to speak with me, but only once, and only off the record. He would not allow me to record the conversation. What I can tell you is this. He told me that the void was not empty. The radar had detected a return signal from within it, something with density, something that displaced the water that should have filled that space. He told me that the shape of the void had changed between 2 passes of the instrument taken 6 hours apart, not collapsed, changed. He told me that on the final day of the survey, the entire team heard a sound through the ice. He described it as a low, resonant hum that made the equipment vibrate. He said it lasted 40 seconds. He said they packed up the site that afternoon and did not return. When I asked him why he had not included any of this in the published report, he said, "Because no one would believe it, and I would lose my funding." When I asked him if he thought the void was connected to the 1950 station, he said, "I think we should stop drilling in that region." Then he ended the call. There is a second photograph. I found it in 2021 in the estate sale of a man named Hector Ruiz, who had served as a radio operator for the Chilean Navy in the 1950s. The photograph is small, creased, printed on the kind of thick paper they used for official documentation. It shows the same dark fissure in the ice, the same perspective as the image I described earlier, but this one is dated March 11th, 1950, 4 days before the final log entry. In the lower right corner of the frame, standing perhaps 10 meters from the edge of the fissure, is a man in a dark parka. His face is turned toward the crack. His posture is stiff. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone has written a single sentence in Spanish. Él dijo que algo lo estaba mirando. He said something was looking at him. I do not know who wrote it. I do not know who the man in the photograph is, but I know that 4 days later, the log stopped. Let me be clear about the most common explanation, because it is the one you will hear if you go looking for this case in skeptical circles, and it is not without merit. The theory is this: the sound was ice. Antarctic ice shelves produce low-frequency emissions as they crack, shift, and carve. These sounds can propagate for hundreds of kilometers through water and ice. The regularity of the interval, the skeptics argue, could be explained by tidal cycles or thermal expansion creating repetitive stress fractures. The spiral pattern could be an artifact of atmospheric refraction distorting the source location. The men at the station, isolated for months in total darkness, could have experienced a shared delusion or panic. Psychological collapse is well documented in Antarctic winter overcruise. The fissure in the ice could have been natural. The void beneath the ice could be a subglacial lake. The 2003 American recording could be unrelated or misidentified. And the silence, the seizure of records, the lost men, the classified materials could simply be bureaucratic reflexes in an era when governments did not explain themselves. I have spent years inside this material. I find parts of this explanation persuasive. Ice does sing, men do break, records do vanish without conspiracy. But ice does not move in spirals, ice does not learn intervals, and ice does not stop. The coordinates are 64 degrees, 9 minutes south, 62 degrees, 55 minutes west. The void is still there. In 2018, a research team from the British Antarctic Survey passed within 12 kilometers of the site. They did not stop. They did not deploy instruments. When I wrote to the expedition leader and asked why that region had been excluded from their survey grid, he replied that it had been deemed low priority for the study's objectives. When I pressed, he did not reply again. In 2020, the Chilean government quietly established a 2-kilometer exclusion zone around the former site of Station Arturo Prat, citing structural instability of the ice shelf. No drilling, no surface expeditions, no overflights below 3,000 meters. The order is still in effect. I have tried to find out who requested it. I cannot. Go back to the moment the sound changed. March 14th, 1950. 87 days of perfect regularity, and then the interval shortens. The thing beneath the ice is no longer waiting. It is closing distance. The men in that station heard it through the floor. They felt it in their bones. And then the single word in the log, cercano. Close. Not, it is close. Just close. The way you would write it if your hand was shaking. The way you would write it if you heard the ice above you begin to crack and you realized the sound had been a countdown all along and you had just run out of time. I do not know what made the sound. I do not know what the men saw. But I know that something was there beneath 3 kilometers of ice, and it knew they were listening. And I know that we have decided collectively and quietly not to go back.